may not fit neatly within the Exchange Act, and as the Commission noted in its 1997 concept release on Regulation ATS, it's easy to give in to the tendency to try to discourage innovation in order to protect existing practices. But, as the Commission explained in that release, the SEC has, over its history, also sought to accommodate market innovations within the existing statutory framework to the extent possible in light of investor protection concerns without imposing regulation that would stifle or threaten the commercial viability of such innovations. In other words, it's important for the Commission, and here I'm quoting the concept release again, to cultivate an atmosphere in which innovation is welcome and possible. Fortunately, we have an incredibly qualified group of panelists and a moderator with years of experience as an Exchange Act lawyer to help us understand how the Commission might accommodate innovations in the way assets are traded. Thank you all for agreeing to participate in this discussion. I noted prior to our first roundtable that the task force has benefited from our engagement with the public, and I'm happy to report that this engagement is ongoing. The quality of written submissions is impressive, and we continue to learn from market participants willing to get into the weeds with us and talk in detail about their challenges and possible solutions. Please continue this engagement. Before I turn the podium over to our three commissioners, I'd like to remind everyone that this event is being streamed live and is being covered by multiple media outlets. Accordingly, please be aware that all remarks by Commission officials, participants, and members of our audience will be on the record. In addition, please remember that the participants in today's roundtable speak on their own behalf and that their views do not necessarily reflect the views of the Commission, the Commissioners, or members of the Commission staff. We're now ready to begin, first with recorded remarks from our Acting Chairman, Mark 𝐂𝐡, followed by remarks from Commissioner Crenshaw and Commissioner Peirce.
They are tasked with forcing. That's correct.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Crypto Task Force's second roundtable, which is focused on crypto trading. Over 200 years ago, a group of stockbrokers gathered under a buttonwood tree to establish basic rules for the trading of securities on an organized market in New York City. Today, we are at a similar point in time in the history of markets as we gather to discuss the regulation of crypto asset trading within the United States. Early securities markets developed organically in response to supply and demand. Like the early securities markets, organized markets for crypto asset trading developed organically in response to supply and demand for the emerging asset class. The first crypto markets operated entirely out of the regulatory perimeter. A number of state agencies exercised regulatory authority over crypto markets under the view that the platforms were akin to currency exchanges and subject to money transmitter licensing laws. State regulation of crypto asset trading raises the potential for there to be a patchwork of state licensing regimes. We should consider whether there may be a more efficient method of regulation. Under an accommodating federal regulatory framework, some market participants would likely prefer to offer trading in both tokenized securities and non-security crypto assets under a single SEC license, rather than offer trading solely in non-security crypto assets under 50 different state licenses. However, the federal securities laws and regulations may present challenges for broker-dealers and national securities exchanges seeking to offer trading in tokenized securities. For example, national securities exchanges can only list registered securities, and most tokenized securities in the market today are unregistered. Additionally, compliance with Rule 611, also known as the Order Protection Rule, may not be possible with respect to customer orders for securities that trade in both tokenized and non-tokenized formats in on- and off-chain markets. Incumbent crypto asset trading platforms seeking to offer trading in tokenized securities also face unique obstacles. Unlike securities exchanges, crypto asset trading platforms are typically vertically integrated, with custody, execution, and clearing all occurring on the same platform. Blockchain technology offers the potential to execute and clear securities transactions in ways that may be more efficient and reliable than current processes. For example, blockchains can be used to manage and mobilize collateral in tokenized form to increase capital efficiency and liquidity. Additionally, decentralized finance software protocols allow users to transact on a 24/7 basis via smart contracts. The drafters of the federal securities laws did not contemplate the use of blockchains or smart contracts to perform the functions of a transfer agent, facilitate the exchange of securities, or clear securities transactions. While the Commission works to develop a long-term solution to address these issues, a time-limited conditional exemptive relief framework for registrants and non-registrants could allow for greater innovation with blockchain technology within the United States in the near term. I encourage market participants that are developing new ways to trade securities using blockchain technology to provide input on where exemptive relief may be appropriate. Thank you to the Crypto Task Force and the panelists for your time in preparing for this roundtable.
Oh my God. That guy has to get his head on straight. It is really hard to listen to such a crooked guy. He sounds like Cryptos R Us.
To the discussions that
what's
follow.
With that? Just a little bit. Not a lot of it, a little bit. That hissing was again their audio. Thank you, King Peasant. I cut my own hair. What do you guys think? Not bad? Maybe I should go into hairstyling. Maybe. Nobody's even at the podium? Dude, who organizes this shit?
Good afternoon.
For real,
Welcome,
who
everyone,
organizes
to the second
this?
installment of the Crypto Task Force's Roundtables. Today we focus on crypto trading. This is a topic of particular interest to me because it wades into, as you've just heard from Chairman Ueda, into some of the practical implications, questions, challenges, and risks that impact actual investors who own, and therefore trade, crypto of all varieties. Any conversation about crypto trading quickly reveals the immense complexity and unique nature of these transactions. In thinking about these complexities, I can't help but consider them from the perspective of a retail investor. What is a retail investor's expectation for how their crypto investments move through a trading platform? What protections do they naturally assume that they have based on crypto's company's marketing and their experience with more traditional investments? Do they actually have the benefit of those protections in practice? Perhaps they should, but do they? And if they don't, how are they warned of that? In addition to investor protections, we of course have to consider how crypto trading platforms may or may not fit into our existing regulatory regime for national securities exchanges and alternative trading systems. Crypto trading platforms are unique.
She was on 2X, we could catch up.
Because, among other reasons, they often perform multiple services under one roof, sometimes including brokerage, clearing, and custody. Each of these functions is vitally important.
She's had a lot of coffee. No, I sped her up so that we could catch up. There we go.
Perhaps they should, but do they?
Real fast.
And if they don't,
fastest in the West.
How are they warned of that? In addition to investor protections, we of course have to consider how crypto trading platforms may or may not fit into our existing regulatory regime for national securities exchanges and alternative trading systems. Crypto trading platforms are unique because, among other reasons, they often perform multiple services under one roof, sometimes including brokerage, clearing, and custody. Each of these functions is vitally important to maintaining the safety and integrity of assets entrusted by investors to such entities. In traditional finance, these are typically performed by separate registered entities. That's because of the high risk of conflicts of interest and risks for investors. Because many of these entities are not registered with a regulator, not the SEC, not with the states, and not with an SRO, they often do not comply with any of the existing laws designed to minimize these risks and potential conflicts. Though the SEC has urged investors to exercise caution, in some instances we have seen some of those risks materialize in a way that has caused significant market disruption and harm to investors. After those instances, we become painfully aware of the mismatch between investors' expectations and reality. Investors didn't realize that their crypto may be held in a single wallet controlled solely by the exchange.
By the scams.
Investors didn't realize that custodially held crypto would be treated as property of the exchange in a bankruptcy proceeding.
That's true. That's a Celsius BlockFi
Investors didn't realize
argument.
that their investments were not covered by any FDIC or SIPC insurance. Beyond the consequences to individual investors, these ongoing risks propose a large threat to orderly functioning of the crypto markets and potentially also to the banking system and traditional finance. So where do we go from here? That's where you and the Roundtable come in. How do we approach the question of crypto exchange registration? How do on and off-chain transactions comply with broker-dealers' obligations, Best X, or customer protection rule? That's just some of them. I know there are many more that you will address today. How can we address and minimize custody risks and conflicts of interest? Together, let's explore answers
Together
to
is
these
how.
difficult questions
Together.
that can protect both investors and the markets. Thank you all for your continued participation.
Thank you,
and look
whoever
forward to
you
hearing
are.
what you have to say today.
Thank you, whoever you are. We appreciate you. YouTube has downgraded the stream from 1080p. Something about keyframes. I'm not sure why. Just randomly having this issue. You guys are saying the connection is good, so we're going to keep going. Let's go. Keep smashing those
Welcome,
likes and
everyone.
subscribes,
It's great
guys.
to have you all
Hype
here,
it up. Hype it
watching
up.
in person or
What's up,
online.
Ben? Share.
We're happy to have our second in a series of roundtables dedicated to discussing regulatory challenges and opportunities in the crypto asset market. I'd like to thank all the staff who are making these roundtables possible. It's a lot of work, and thanks also to the folks who have submitted responses to our requests for information and to people who have come in to meet with the Crypto Task Force. These materials and discussions have been informative, and I hope that you'll continue to engage with us. I found the first roundtable useful in shaping my thoughts on when crypto assets implicate the securities laws. Given the expert panelists who have graciously agreed to share their time with us today, I'm confident that this discussion will be just as fruitful and engaging as the first one was. Our panelists
Fruitful.
represent a variety of institutions, including national securities exchanges, alternative trading systems, and crypto-native firms that engage in or facilitate various types of centralized and decentralized trading activities. The different perspectives will continue to contribute to an interesting conversation, but also will highlight an important feature of successful markets, the ability to pursue a wide range of business models and approaches to trading. This flexibility fosters innovation, increases competition, and ultimately benefits investors. We should keep this in mind as we consider an appropriate regulatory framework for crypto asset markets. Notwithstanding the diverse range of approaches to trading, I expect that many common issues will emerge. For example, firms are interested in offering investors the ability to engage in pairs trading or the trading of a security against a crypto asset, such as a stablecoin. SEC rules do not prohibit this activity, but given that securities historically have been quoted and settled in U.S. dollars, certain of our rules, such as record keeping, reporting, and national market system rules, may not clearly contemplate pairs trading. Would it be helpful for us to provide guidance about how any of our rules might apply to pairs trading, or whether any rules
Yes.
should be modified to better accommodate or account for this type of activity?
I can say yes,
A related set of issues
definitively.
that I hope you'll consider are authority and jurisdictional issues. As a general matter, the SEC's authority is limited to securities activity. What can and should we do in the short term, and what should Congress consider in the longer term to ensure that there are that the regulatory gaps are filled as firms increasingly seek to combine securities and non-securities trading activity? In addition, because the SEC is just one of many federal regulators and state regulators as well that currently and in the future may play a role in crypto regulation, what concerns do you have about potentially overlapping or even conflicting regulatory regimes? In the near term, how useful would it be for the Commission using its exemptive authorities to permit limited-scale market testing by intermediaries? What would appropriate guardrails be on such testing? Participating firms could see what works and what doesn't technically and commercially, and such trials could also inform the Commission's rulemaking efforts. Finally, as daunting as the task is before us, the Commission has experience adapting a regulatory framework to new and innovative technologies and methods for trading. In 1984, for example, the Commission issued a release expressing its views on computer brokerage systems that allowed investors to send orders to brokers without the use of a telephone. In 1998,
Without
the
the use
Commission
of a
issued a
telephone.
statement regarding the use of the Internet to offer securities services, and Regulation ATS was a response to the development of new types of trading systems made possible by advancements in technology. What lessons can these and other examples of integrating new technology into our markets teach us? Our moderator, Nick Losurdo, and I are both fans of apple cider vinegar.
That's a
ACV,
random-ass
as
reference.
we
You do
believers
that.
call it, is supposed to be a good for whatever ails you. People clamor, especially for ACV with the mother. which is the bacterial bundle
Where
that
are
gives
we?
ACV its probiotic punch, or at least so we believe. A
Where
close
are
look
we?
at the tangled mess that is called the mother might scare you, but ingesting it is good. So too, the topics before our panel, we're looking at an unsightly, legal and technical knot of issues, but the
Just
conversations
like
among our
apple
expert
cider
panel will
vinegar.
undoubtedly
Full
be good for
circle.
us. Nick, it's all yours.
Just like apple cider vinegar. None of what I say makes any sense. And that is why we are here today.
Thank you for that, and welcome. You know, it's tough when I travel. I don't actually bring a big bottle of ACV with me, so I'll probably stop by the store and get some later.
Gotta
But,
go get some
good
apple
afternoon. It's
cider
really
vinegar.
great to see so
ACV
many
as the
folks here,
cool
especially
kids
on a Friday, on a
call it.
rainy day in DC. As my 4-year-old Cam would say, whenever we have a big event coming up, today's the day, and I'm really excited that today is finally the day for us to be here.
For sure.
Thank you
For sure,
for
you
this
are here that
commission
day.
and its leadership. Thank you, Commissioner Peirce, Commissioner Crenshaw, Chairman Ueda, wherever you are today, Richard Gabbert, Samira, and the rest of the Crypto Task Force. Thank you for this panel. I really appreciate everyone giving their time on a Friday. I know everyone's busy, particularly this time of year, and we're really, really lucky to have you here to share your thoughts. Before we go forward, I thought it would make sense to maybe take a step back and look back, and so bear with me on this one. October 2018, 6.5 years ago, I was actually in this room. It's my first week on the job. I was counsel to then Commissioner Eladd Roisman. I was excited, I was nervous, I was giddy. It was a really awesome opportunity, and I was really excited about the job. And that week, I had the treat of actually having a 2-day roundtable here in this room covering equity market data. We got to listen to top-notch industry experts. We got to have great conversation. The dialogue that day led to important rulemaking over the course of the next few weeks and months, months and years rather. And without that, that rulemaking either wouldn't have happened or wouldn't have been as good as it was. It shows that these roundtables can and do work, and it's incredibly important that we have them. Now, crypto was a thing 6.5 years ago. It was a thing
Some
six
say
and a half
even
months ago.
farther ago.
I'll say I wish
back
we
than
would have
6
had a
years ago.
roundtable like this
Some.
earlier than today. But as the saying goes, we're here today, and better late than never.
Some say.
Let me say a little bit about moving forward. I think it's incredibly important for this industry that we get, at a minimum, regulatory clarity on just about every topic we're going to talk about today. And for many of these, if not most of these, I'm kind of a needy person, we should be aiming for regulatory certainty so that 6.5 years from now, we are not in the position that we have been in for the past 6.5 and that we are in today. So let me tell a little bit about the roundtable and how I see it going. We've got 2 sessions. The first session, we're going to get into broad-based topics, specific topics. We're going to dig deep. We're going to share all these views that the roundtable panelists have. In the second session, after the break, starting at around 3:30, I believe, so come back if you leave us then, we're going to actually offer up ideas that the commission can run with to inform it with its future rulemaking, future guidance, future staff relief, really the direction it's going to take its mission and its role and its approach with respect to crypto trading over the next couple of months and
like
couple of
crypto
years.
trading.
I want to stress that we're here today to talk about crypto
go.
trading.
We are.
As was mentioned, there was already a roundtable on security status. There was a lot of discussion of 𝐿𝐼. There are roundtables coming up on crypto custody, DeFi, and tokenization. Did I get those all? I think I did. So we're going to bump up against those topics, but we're really going to try to stay focused on crypto trading to really do this roundtable.
Long or short, baby.
so
Long or short. Let's
Bios
go.
for all the panelists are on the website.
go.
We're not going to do intros or bios. These are
Thank
some
God.
of the top experts in the space who have been in the space for
Thank you for having me.
most people over a decade.
Thank you for
And
having
so I'm
me.
looking
Thank you
forward
again.
to a really, really great discussion.
Happy
With
to be
that,
here, bud.
why don't we get into it? And I'm going to break this down into the grammar school way of writing and thinking, the who, what, when, where, why, and how. We're going to start with the what today. And the first question, and we're just going to go right down the panel, starting with you, Dave. You're up first. When we talk about SEC regulation of crypto trading, what should that actually be? What should the SEC have jurisdiction over? What should be in scope? And perhaps as importantly, what should not be in scope? What should the SEC not have jurisdiction over? I'll remind you that the the commissioners are in the room. But I encourage everybody to speak freely so that the commission and the staff can actually take our feedback and run with that over the next few months. and years.
Fartcoin, way
There you
beyond
go.
your jurisdiction.
Thanks,
Don't even
Nick.
get close to it.
Thank
Don't
you,
even touch it.
Commissioner Peirce and Crenshaw, for having me here at the Crypto Task Force. Very much appreciate everyone's ideas and receptivity to our thoughts and to be on a panel with all of you. It's great. No pressure to go first, of course. But when I think of scope, I'm thinking of it at least in two ways. The first and simplest is that securities are securities. And digital securities should be regulated by the SEC. I do think another way to think about it is that you can expand scope to consider broader investor protection questions along with regulatory agency cooperation. I have found that the turf warfare, the infighting, the constant question of who should be regulating what has caused investor harm directly. And I think that's been extremely problematic over the course of the last few years, watching regulatory agencies grapple with crypto, whether they're securities or commodities. And
Nobody
so,
knows.
You know, regardless of
knows.
whether something falls under the purview of the SEC or the CFTC, I think there's so many interlinkages and so much potential crossover that it's incumbent for these two agencies to work very closely together. I'm a strong believer that there are real benefits to crypto technology. There's the opportunity for real-time settlement, collateral management, incredible transparency that is really unprecedented in our sort of centralized world of equity trading, reduced
like this
counterparty
guy.
risk, disintermediation opportunities, and self-custody, and all sorts of other things that I'm sure we're going to talk about. But there's nothing magical about the blockchain that eliminates the core principles of investor protection. And I really believe strongly in much of the things that I'm going to talk about today are really centered on that, on investor protection. If you want true adoption as an industry, you need to have guardrails, and you need to give the public confidence in what they're buying or selling.
So this guy,
Everyone wants crypto to be successful, and we really need responsible innovation and right-sized regulation that's tailored to the industry.
this guy knows what we need for adoption, because he
Thanks,
just
Dave.
definitively said.
And thank you guys all for hosting us today. I was told not to do too long of a thank you, so I'll keep it brief. But feel really fortunate to be in this room and to have the opportunity to have a dialogue, right, about this industry asset class and the best path forward, specifically in the United States, for us to continue to innovate. And I think from my perspective, bring more and more activity back on shore. Right. If you look at this market, I think the interesting component is if you look just pure trading activity overall, about 85% of global crypto volume is outside of the United States today. And I think that as Congress, SEC, CFTC are working to provide regulatory clarity to this space, and the president talks about U.S. being the crypto hub of the world, that's the metric that I think we should be watching to really measure the success in terms of what we're able to do. And I know, like Dave mentioned, there's a lot of work that's being done around the definition of these different assets. I'm hopeful that we'll get legislation there. And on the question of like, okay, where should the SEC focus? I think for the assumptions of this conversation, what I am making is that that primary focus will obviously be on the security side of this space. And within that, both the assets that are defined to be securities as well as the different market participants that fall under securities regulation, right? Whether those are exchanges, broker-dealers, custodians. I think that there's a lot of opportunity and work to be done in terms of getting more players licensed within the space and showing them the clear frameworks to basically continue to operate within this market. Last thing I would say is that, I think that while the commodity side, I would imagine, would be out of scope in the net new legislation that we will see, I do think that there's really interesting conversations for us to have about how broker-dealers and other market participants actually can transact those assets, interact with different crypto commodities like Bitcoin. And I think that to the extent that there's opportunities to solve some of this patchwork legislation that Acting Chair mentioned at the beginning, that would be a huge unlock for American innovation and the path forward. So thank you, guys.
Fartcoin. Can we ask about Fartcoin, Senator?
Thank you for having me. Just as an apology to any lawyers in the room, I'm not a lawyer, so when I use the word security
Same.
or anything like this, I'm basically talking the way an economist would. It's something that people buy and sell because they think it has value. So I realize that that's
Fair. That's
a different
fair.
world.
I
But,
feel like that
okay.
should be the
So how do I
definition.
think about markets? I think about people trying to access markets, and typically they go through an intermediary. Then I think about the actual performance of the market, what the characteristics are, and I think about what they're actually trading. And this is actually a very difficult problem in crypto, sort of by backward induction. What people are going to be trading in crypto markets typically is not designed or developed in the US. And so the usual restrictions or the usual things that the SEC
know about
does
that.
to ensure that everyone knows what's being traded, at the moment, we don't know, right? We don't even know why these things have value. So this is sort of a difficult problem that has to be solved. Then there's the question of how markets conduct themselves. And to some extent, we know how continuous limit order markets should work. We sort of understand that. What we don't understand is exactly how automated market makers, for example, should work. And that's a different
Yeah.
thing altogether. We also don't know how those two
She's not wrong.
systems should interact when it comes to things like, what is
She's
the
quiet.
price at the moment? Well, it depends. Am I in blockchain time? Am I in real time, right? And so this is sort of complicated. Now, the thing that the SEC has always done, I think, really, really well, which is to look after people who have a little bit of money to invest, but are not fabulously sophisticated about it. And what does that mean? That means they're going through an intermediary to access the market. And it's got to be the case that the intermediaries that most people who are just trying to invest in these assets go through are intermediaries that are safe and secure, and they don't just blow up overnight. So that's something that I think the SEC should really, really focus on. Unfortunately, because this is a global asset class, you cannot prevent me, I don't think, maybe you can, I don't know. You can't prevent me from having some sort of wallet and accessing a blockchain directly and doing whatever. And so in the past, we've sort of used financial levels as essentially denoting sophistication.
What time is it
In this
blockchain
world,
time right now?
what denotes sophistication is whether or not you're able to basically put a wallet that's non-custodial and sort of do your own thing. And so I think really the focus should be on how usual people who have a little bit of money and aren't too sophisticated, how they access the market and to make sure that that's safe.
I know we don't
Those are
love
great
her, but
points.
she actually
I,
had some like
I
smart
will also start with
stuff.
a thank you. It's such a critical time for exactly this kind of engagement and to be able to have an open and transparent dialogue. And so it's great to be here, and we appreciate the opportunity to engage. I was also encouraged by, in the opening remarks, the reference to Reg ATS. I started my career actually on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange in 1992, and had the fortune of watching a lot of the rules and regs that were referenced actually coming into be. And ATS, out of all of those, probably had the most impact, I think, because it encouraged competition. And I think if there's one thing we've learned from how crypto works today is that competition has a lot to do with making markets orderly and well-functioning. So to me, this is a moment when we have a generational opportunity, I think, in a lot of ways, to really think back to first principles about the things that are most important: investor protection, fair and orderly markets, safety and soundness of assets, but using a lot of new tools and techniques to take a market that already is pretty efficient, but operationally make it even more efficient,
Extremely
and
efficient.
more transparent and easier to comply and easier to show that customer assets are where they're supposed to be and that they're protected. But there are new and novel ways to do that I think will actually make markets even better and afford even more protections to the
Go
retail
on.
users.
Go on. Nope, that was it.
Well, I echo everyone's thanks to the commission and the commissioners for having us here today. It's a real pleasure to be here as a representative of the crypto industry, and in particular, as a representative of decentralized finance, or DeFi. In many ways, DeFi shares a lot of the mission that the commission, that drives the commission, including making markets more fair and efficient and protecting the participants in those markets. So, Nick, I really appreciate the framing of this question, specifically focusing on the what, or the activity that is inside or potentially outside the SEC's scope, and very much setting aside the question of what is a security or a securities transaction, which does have some real limits under existing law, but we'll see how that law develops. There are a few activities in particular that I think rightly sit on the outside of the bounds of the Commission's authority over crypto trading. And in particular, that would include peer-to-peer transactions and the provision of self-custody products that are the infrastructure for those transactions. In securities law, we often regulate intermediaries in no small part, because the nature of the relationship with users, between those users and the intermediaries, presents very particular risks. Custody of assets, access to confidential information, exercising discretion on behalf of those participants, acting as counterparties. All of those things have great value, but come with risks. But many of those risks substantially or entirely disappear when, for example, a participant in a transaction retains custody or control of their own assets, and the transaction is self-directed by that participant, and it takes place on a public ledger like a blockchain. And that's the heart of much of DeFi technology. So I'll note that peer-to-peer transactions are not a new thing, even for securities. If you go back in time to when we had paper stock certificates, often there were blanks on those pieces of paper that could be filled out in ink to do a peer-to-peer transaction of that stock certificate. But as we've moved securities transactions into the digital age, we've somewhat taken that element of simplicity and efficiency away from the markets, and DeFi now gives us a chance to put some of that back in. So the point is that just because a new technology allows people to transact without an intermediary does not mean that we can or should regulate that technology, that infrastructure, as if it is an intermediary, because it's not, because the activity, to go back to Nick's question, of that intermediary doesn't exist, because the intermediary itself does not exist. So there may be longer discussions today on particular categories of assets and how that trading would work. On DeFi in particular, tokenized stock, where certain rights will travel with those assets. But there are many solutions that the blockchain could provide for that, and that could be solvable in any number of ways. It doesn't mean that peer-to-peer securities transactions necessarily have to fit within the existing regimes of an exchange model or even an ATS model.
Thank you. It is an honor to be here. I'd like to thank the Commission and the Crypto Task Force and my fellow panelists. I think we have a tremendous opportunity now with the new administration in place that is more open to innovation and discussing out a framework.
She works for Uniswap.
We have the opportunity to correct the policy gaps of the past and design a framework with clear rules that encourages fair and orderly markets, protects investors, promotes innovation, and cements the US position as a leader in digital assets. What I would like to discuss today is how we can move to a federal regulatory regime that can take us away from that patchwork we've heard about of 50 different state regulators, money transmission licenses, bit licenses, trust banks, trust companies, and so forth, and the general lack of openness that has discouraged innovation, increased costs, reduced efficiency, distorted markets, and ultimately has failed to protect investors. I believe that we should adapt our existing regulatory structures to rapidly create a federal rules-based framework for crypto trading. Over the previous, I know you mentioned 6 years, Nick, maybe 6 years, 4 years, whatever the number is, we've wasted time, and I think we've got some catching up to do. We've got a system in place now that for decades investors have accessed capital markets through regulated intermediaries like broker-dealers. And over the years, this framework has evolved, correcting and adapting as markets have changed, as Commissioner Peirce just mentioned. And I think it's now time that the broker-dealer regime further evolves to incorporate crypto and digital assets. Of course, this is not to say that the existing regulations are perfect. that's kind of a mantra that we heard over the last 4 years, that we don't need new rules, we just need people to follow the rules. Well, that's clearly false.
That's never been right.
There's no doubt that new and updated rules are required, and that Congress will likely need to pass new laws, along with input from the SEC, other regulators like the CFTC. And
Let's
we
go.
kind of decide here, and I hope to be part of that conversation, how we can come together and modernize the regulatory framework and the market structure for crypto trading.
Yeah, that's accurate. These people are pretty based. They're actually...
I just want to echo everyone's thanks. Thank you to the Commission and to the Crypto Task Force for having me on behalf of Cumberland DRW, and thank you to my fellow panelists as well.
All right, Chelsea Pizzola.
For a minute, trying not to overlap too much with the first panel, but I think just to touch on where it sort of overlaps with secondary market trading, I think in terms of what's in and what's out of scope, there have been multiple courts that have ruled, and I think, seems hopefully uncontroversial at this point to say that, when we're talking about, non-tokenized assets, but just sort of natively digital assets, those aren't inherently securities. You need to look at, when you're applying Howey, it needs to be done on a sort of a transaction-by-transaction basis, looking at the facts and circumstances of the particular transaction and saying, does it meet the Howey test? And I think when we do that with secondary market transactions, I think we see that even if the initial sale of a token may have met the Howey test, when we look in the secondary markets, we see that typically there are multiple reasons why a transaction in those markets may fail the Howey test. And so, for example, we've seen multiple circuits rule that if you don't have pooling of investor funds, for the purposes of development of the network and for purposes of sort of a profit-making endeavor, then you don't have horizontal commonality, which the Sixth and Seventh Circuits in particular have required. And so without that, you just don't have the common enterprise prong of Howey. And you might say, well, some courts have said vertical commonality is enough. I think that just gets us into sort of a morass of confusion. And I think, to the point that a couple of panelists have made, we really need clear rules of the road. And so I think, to say that, if you don't have pooling, then you don't have, a common enterprise, so there's no, investment contract under Howey, I think that's a clear rule of the road that people can follow that I think would be really helpful. So just, something practical that people could look to. And I think, there have been multiple courts from, Binance to Ripple, even though, Ripple wasn't looking at secondary market transactions, but I think still, saying, if you don't have investors having an expectation that their funds are going to go, to the issuer or promoter to be used in sort of a profit-making endeavor with respect to the network, then you just don't have, you don't have either a common enterprise or you don't have an expectation of profits. But either way, you don't have an investment contract under Howey. And so I think, that could just be a really helpful piece of, we can get into sort of mechanics for how, the commission might provide clarity in the second session, but I think that would just be a really helpful sort of, piece of guidance or piece of, rulemaking or just clarity that the commission could provide that, I think could really help in sort of secondary markets when we're looking at what's in and what's out of scope. Thank you.
Let's go. What's up, John Winter?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the commission as well for having us, the task force, fellow panelists, and Nick for your time and effort in arranging this and organizing this. I think I want to start by addressing crypto more broadly, crypto trading. I think it is. It's
I'd like to start by addressing apple
the
cider
surface area
vinegar.
is so vast
This channel is brought to you by
that,
apple cider
again,
vinegar.
At least in my mind, the taxonomy matters a lot when we're talking about specific use cases with respect to using some of these emerging technologies to improve existing regulated securities markets, or as we look to open up more broader investor access to some of the assets that have emerged from crypto. I think I want to start, though, by kind of laying out, I think there's three kind of key principles. If you look back at any market that has, thrived and sustained time. And, they're kind of basic principles, but I think they really matter, I think, with the purpose of what we'll talk about today. The first is trust, right? And I think market participants need trust in order to be able to interact with a counterparty that they otherwise wouldn't be able to if they weren't, knowing of them or weren't introduced to them. That trust is kind of the backbone of any successful market over time. Participants also, they need to be trusted that they'll be protected against fraud and manipulation and misappropriation of funds, and trust that they're on a level playing field with other market participants. The second one is liquidity. And I think liquidity is important because liquidity is a measure of a market and how it stands up both in times of calm and in times of stress. And liquidity is achieved really through looking at, what are the objectives of the market in terms of promoting efficient risk transfer services from one participant to another. And that results in depth in size, depth in price, typically through the collective interest of many participants coming together to form that price discovery. And lastly, I think resiliency. And resiliency is something that comes with time. It is never been more important than it is in the information age we live in today. And really, is not indicative that a market can't innovate and evolve. In fact, it's the opposite, right? You have to adopt new technologies. You have to evolve with the world around you as new things get introduced to sort of be resilient and stand the test of time. I want to thank Chairman Ueda for the shout out in his introduction, talking about the exchange. I feel like it's, there's no better story than that, right? And the evolution of the New York Stock Exchange over its 230 plus year history, there's many, many, many phases. And I think, one of the things that I thought would be good to share is nothing more, I think, relevant than the current phase we found ourselves in the last decade after Intercontinental Exchange acquired the NYSE. They made a concerted effort and a bet to sort of overhaul the entire technology of the exchange, the back end, if you will. And it's so important because I think when people think of the New York Stock Exchange, they think of the 6 pillars of the facade of our building or our iconic trading floor. But if you were to look underneath the hood, you would find a highly sophisticated, state-of-the-art technology stack that literally gets tested every day and is at the cutting edge of what's pushing markets forward. And I think we've been reminded of that this past week, as has the broader market, in terms of, you have to be ready for the unexpected and be ready to stand up and provide those risk transference services. And, I think that's important to point out now because these are the times when you need resiliency, right? And you need to trust that counterparties will be there when you need them to, and infrastructure will be there when you need them to. And I think a lot of that would not have been possible without competition, without the adoption of new technologies, but it also reminds me of the role that regulation plays in it, right? Regulation has a way of keeping the market participants accountable to one another and accountable to a North Star that is established by principles like the ones I mentioned. And so I think it's just, it seemed evident to mention with regards to all of us being around this table today, in essence, it affirms the role regulation has to play in terms of helping pave a path forward and helping bring some of these new technologies into other markets in new and exciting ways, as well as open up more investor access to some of the unique assets coming out of crypto. Thank you.
Hi. The benefit of going last is I get to hear all the smart things other people said and say yes, yes, yes. So I'll start with a couple of things. First is, look, we're talking about trading financial assets. As it turns out, we have lots of expertise in this room here, in this room out here. I'm looking at former commissioners of another agency and commissioners here. There's so much expertise in trading financial assets. We aren't starting with a blank slate here. We know some functions have to happen when you're trading financial assets. We know that investors are going to go to someone to act as their broker. They may believe that they would want maybe that broker to be looking out for their best interests. There's common law, centuries of common law about agency principle and a fiduciary duty that attaches to that. That's been put into a rule by FINRA and MSRB as a best execution rule. We've learned a lot from trading these assets, and I want to pick up on something he said a moment ago, which is resiliency and trust being really important things. Those are not necessarily functions of just competitiveness. Those are like the byproducts of also effective regulation. You know, we've learned in those other financial products that most of our rules, both at this agency and others, come out of crises, right? They come out of abuses. We see that different trading centers for decades and decades and decades have different prices, and hey, maybe their intermediaries are ripping them off, so we start to get consolidated tapes 50 years ago. Then we see, hey, wait, we have a flash crash on May 6, 2010. I remember talking to many of you back then, and as it turns out, many of the folks here were like, hey, we should have some circuit breakers. We end up with a limit down rule that works on stability. We say, hey, we're worried about market access because as it turns out, we need to know who's coming into our markets and maybe causing abuses and manipulations. So we have a market access rule that comes from that. These are lessons we've learned in all of our markets. And I think when we talk about how to regulate trading digital assets, we should be learning pretty heavily from what we learned from trading other assets. We need to know, hey, is my broker looking out for me and my best interests and my best price or my best execution or not? Hey, how are they custodying that? Or how am I going to custody that? These are not new problems. Now, there are certainly things about digital assets, particularly in like clearing and settlement and other things that may be very different. But I'll also pose not so much, too. We also have an awful lot of off-chain trading. How do we reflect that in something like a consolidated tape? So I'll start with, when we think about what's the best way to do this, we should be thinking about what the function someone is serving. Are they serving as a trading center? Are they the exchange? Or a matching place between private participants? Are they acting as the broker? I will argue many of the folks that I interact with, Healthy Markets as pensions, investment advisors, and others, they may have great interest in trading digital assets and not investing directly because of this trust, because of the concerns with resiliency. They may feel much more comfortable going through a registered investment advisor and an ETP and relying on those protections and saying, look, registered investment advisor, this is your problem. Like, you now have to figure out that stuff. We're relying on you for that level of expertise because we can't do it. We rely on, so when we think about what this should look like, I say start with the functions and then start with how do we regulate those functions today? Do we need things like best execution obligations? Absolutely. Do we need things like limit up, limit down some circuit breakers? Yes. Do we need consolidated tapes that are on and off chain? Absolutely. And I know, by the way, that's going to be very controversial. But I understand it, and we have to recognize that those things arose out of those things not existing before in other financial markets, and then something went wrong. Somebody abused it. Something broke. So that roundtable in 2018, I sat on the stage then, and I'm thrilled that we're doing this now. But we knew that there were abuses then, and hey, this commission could use to address it, and I'm thrilled that we're focusing on things that have had bipartisan support to promote competitiveness in the equity space, in the fixed income space, and I hope we can do it here.
Well, thanks for the remarks from everyone. I feel like we got a really good, diverse set of perspectives. Oh,
I apologize. Can I
yeah,
one
please.
last-
Sorry, I didn't see
Before
you.
we leave
Yeah.
the what, I just wanted to go back to something that the commissioner said at the beginning, which is how the whatever taxonomy is imposed on this world of digital assets, that it's critically important that we think about the side-by-side trading of these, because even though for the purposes of this discussion, securities are in scope, I can almost guarantee that day one, there will be discussions about how those are traded in the same order book with tokenized money market funds and things that are deemed commodities. And so at the highest level, you could imagine a world where dual registration solves a lot of those things, but at the mechanical level, where is that an ATS? Is that whatever this new category that passes through the FIT bill is, et cetera? Those are critical issues that I think we have to begin with the end in mind in terms of coming up with solutions for, because it will almost certainly be a day one issue as this evolves.
Anyone else want to jump in on that?
If I could, yeah, it's not clear that USD is going to be the natural numeraire, and this is a huge problem. And so somebody has got to think through what the solution is. It's too difficult for me, but.
I want to pick up one thing too. I thought you were going to something David said earlier, and I wanted to pick up and agree violently with it. I think the fight over jurisdiction has been extremely troubling and disappointing. And one of the things I worry about, same thing with what's a security and what may be something immediately adjacent to it. We saw in pretty clear example in the flash crash with something in another market triggering a different related market. I can't think of a better example. There are lots of those things that happen day to day between, options and equities and various swaps. We obviously saw another when we have, equity derivative positions by someone get wildly over concentrated, spread across a couple of banks and crater the market for a few minutes, and hurt a lot of people. And so one of the things I think we really do have to worry about is, one, within products, what gets defined, but also across agencies. Thank you.
Please smash that
Anyone
like
else?
button,
No?
hit subscribe, hype it up.
Well, let's move on to the who for a moment.
Let's move on to
We
the
talked
who.
about the what, and I have
And
some
the
ideas.
doctor.
We're in session 2. We can maybe elaborate on the what a little bit, particularly on your point there, Greg. But for the who, traditionally the SEC is regulating in the trading space, brokers and exchanges and transfer agents and adjacent capacities like clearing agencies. Who should the SEC be focused on with respect to crypto trading? And to the
Not
extent
scammers, apparently.
there is maybe an ordering of priority, what does the panel think that ordering of priority should be first? Like, who should go first? Who should the SEC be focusing on first? And
Scammers.
to the extent you have a why is that?
Well, I'll say if you're a would-be investor in a digital asset, you're going to call or communicate with someone to help you buy that, right? And so I would focus on them first, right? Because that's the interface. And so to me, that's the role that's posed by a broker. And now in the digital asset space, they may then collapse the next several roles into one entity. And I think we have to explore why that. I mean, certainly eliminating all the intermediaries and making sure that they're all under one roof saves costs. You can consolidate the profit centers. It certainly saves oversight. But there are reasons why right now we have rules segregating them. So I would start with my first order of priorities are, frankly, having brokers with things that are registered with a regulator. It could be a FINRA or someone like that. But, basic obligations. Know your customer, know the products. That doesn't mean you have to know the products in something more than like a 15C to 11 way, by the way. And that's an automated quotation rule. The commission's been wrestling with it for years. I apologize. But bipartisan recognition that, if you're going to make quotations in a marketplace, you should have an understanding what it is. Or at least an up-to-date understanding as much as you can. That might not be great. It may not be from the issuer, but it is what it is. I think we need to make sure that the brokers know who they're interacting with. They kind of know what they're interacting in. They kind of have some fiduciary duty to the customer. That might be my members, right, who want to engage in this space. That's a duty of best execution. And by the way, the minute you impose that duty of best execution, you bring a ton more competitiveness and efficiency to the marketplace. Because one of the biggest challenges right now is if I go to that entity and that entity may have a wildly inferior price to someone else, I'll get an execution on that entity. And that may be far worse than what I would get if I was in an equity space where that broker-dealer has to survey a public tape or the consolidated proprietary feeds that they've been putting together and do that. So for me, it's having that broker-level oversight where you know what your customer is, you know who your customer is, you know what it is you're trading, you have the obligation to look out for them, and you have a reference so that they have some form of a tape so that they can do that job, so they can look out to the other venues and figure what's best. Because I will say that is a major inhibitor for some of the largest, particularly if you think of those like public pension funds and others who have fiduciary obligations and state restrictions. Those are the things that are going to act as barriers to them. And part of the reason why their interfaces with digital assets are largely through regulated traditional securities firms.
I agree with that. I think that the starting with brokers makes the most sense. We appreciated the opportunity to respond to the request for information, and in that we suggested that in the panoply of potential structures that could evolve between commodities and securities and so forth, that broker-dealer and ATS, from a pattern matching perspective, matches closest to the activities, at least if we're looking at activities first, what we do today in terms of those things that are dealing with clients and those things that are matching orders and those sorts of things, integrated in a way that allows for the benefits of a straight-through processing and settlement and all of those things. But those regulations seem closest to us in terms of, so we would start there, I think.
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I think that, I guess I can agree with starting with the broker. I'm not sure that I have a good conception though of how to prioritize this, but I do have sort of maybe more of an end state in mind, which is I think that we want to the greatest extent possible, bring crypto trading on exchange. And in order to do that, there's a lot that needs to happen. But all of it seems very doable, especially within sort of the current regulatory system, without really needing to go too far down the path of new legislation or anything. We could take existing disclosure standards and the SEC, and I know I'm maybe treading on recommendations, and I'm trying not to do that, but I think the SEC can do a lot with guidance to bring disclosure standards and registration standards to the point where you can start to get things registered. And the SEC can say, we want this to be with national securities exchanges to the greatest extent possible, and therefore we're going to allow for trading of both securities and non-security assets, and at the same time expand the concept of special purpose broker to also allow brokers to custody non-security crypto assets and crypto security assets and traditional securities. I think if you want to bring crypto trading into the world in which you have investor protection and investor trust, and that word is so important, trust, and you want this industry to expand from that, Austin, that number of 85%, that says it all, right? And if we want to increase the share of the U.S. share of trading and the U.S. share of custody, you need to do things that give investors confidence that they can transact in a way in which they're protected, in which they know that there's disclosure and they can understand exactly what they're transacting, and to have custody solutions that make sense, including independent custody entities being independent from exchanges. There are reasons that the securities laws have evolved to where they're at, and I'm not saying they are perfect in any way, but I agree that they do provide a good foundation to then grow from with this new type of asset.
We need a
One
PAM.
thing I was going to
that's the PAM.
just mention about any of these topics too. I think precision, a high degree of precision matters in terms of what it is we're really referring to with respect to, a digital asset or crypto being on or off exchange. I mean, one could make the argument now that ETFs have been approved, right? Investors have very open access and very, very efficient access to the largest of the crypto assets through ETF providers. And in many ways, the execution cost there is pretty remarkable, as measured in low single digit, all-in execution costs in terms of crossing the spread. But if we're talking about efficiencies for other purposes, like you think of the world of that ETF space, and we'll talk later about this in more detail, there's a tremendous amount of efficiencies that could be gained just from a collateral and capital perspective in terms of, allowing certain SEC-regulated entities to handle some of these assets. And so I think being precise about what it is that we're asking for, I think, and I think this comes more from a practitioner view, is really important, because I think that's where some of these wins will show up. Is in these specific use cases where we either want to broaden access to an asset that has been deemed a commodity token or has been well established, or we want to look at ways that we can leverage a specific technology that's inherent in the crypto space.
Austin, I'd like to hear from you, and then Richard, I think you're the only representative of an actual BD, so I'd love to hear from you after too.
Great, yeah, appreciate it. I know, I feel like I'm on Jeopardy up here. We've got a lot of participation, which is awesome. Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of the points that were made, but I think there's still some fundamental questions in terms of defining and thinking through what this looks like in the digital asset space based on the existing market structure, right? I would almost question like what is a broker within this space, right? Because basically when you're looking at the existing crypto exchanges, and I understand that we're mostly focused now on what like a tokenized future would look like, right? Many players are playing the role of like an integrated broker, exchange, clearinghouse, and custodian in different areas. And I think that from our perspective, what we would advocate for, and I think it's similar to a lot of different people in this panel, is basically just the path to register for those different services that you can offer within the space. And I think that the question that I have, and if I dive deeper in terms of why this asset class may be slightly more different and what we should be thinking about in relation to this space, is I think it's important to remember that these are bearer assets, right? And so when we talk about custody being integrated into other different trading platforms, if I talk about our clients are big institutions who are active within the cryptocurrency markets, like what they want is tri-party custody. What they want is more bank participation within that side of the space to basically remove some of that centralized choke points and risk. And I think that it's important for us to think through, are there centralized choke points and risk, and are there unique aspects of these assets that actually bring more risk than we do have in other spaces? And then how do we make sure that different institutional or retail market participants, obviously important, are able to basically delineate those roles and responsibilities and get the appropriate investor protection there?
So, Nick, your question was, who should the SEC be focusing on? Well, I think the answer is the investor. That should be the number one focus. And then we've had a few panelists just now saying, well, the broker-dealer regime is how investors typically access markets, and you know, Texture Capital is a digital securities broker-dealer regulated by FINRA and the SEC. And I think that this regime does have a lot to offer. We have, you know, as I said, the regime's been around for many years. We have rules around safeguarding customer assets, record keeping, best execution, and so forth. So then we're thinking about the investor, and if the investor is coming through a broker-dealer, in my seat, I've got to think about what I've got best execution obligations. So my customer here wants to execute Bitcoin or Ether or whatever it is.
Execute Bitcoin.
Where can I route this order for them? Maybe it's to Coinbase, and I can get best execution there, or maybe it's to Uniswap. So I think
we're pumping.
In this world, the broker-dealer takes on a lot of that responsibility of, in the same way that we do now, when it comes to best execution, we need to figure out what are the best venues that we can provide access to our customers for. So, and then, you know, another consideration is, what are the custody arrangements? Is it going to be through a clearing broker, perhaps for the cash, perhaps, we'll need other entities if there's stable coins, and certainly if there's crypto involved. So I think once you start looking at the broker-dealer regime, it all trickles down to everything else. Custody, exchanges, and so forth. So I don't think we can really start with one thing. We have to tackle them all kind of, in the same time.
Catherine, go ahead, yeah.
I would feel remiss if I didn't ask the flip side of Austin's question when he said, what is a broker, and say, what is not a broker? There is not always a broker, and there doesn't have to be. That's one tiny piece of clarity that we have gotten from the courts in securities law related to crypto trading in the last couple of years. Also, shout out to Coinbase's submission to the task force, footnote 4. I had not seen that reference before to the 1988 amendments to the Exchange Act where Congress said, let's make sure that participants can participate in transactions without dealers, right? So this concept of not always all of these intermediaries having to exist has also been around for a while. But for all of the reasons we've just discussed about why brokers are regulated, all of the trust that you have to have when you are handing over your transaction to a broker, for all of those reasons, if a participant has a safe way to not hand over that trust and not take on those risks, if we have that technology, we should allow that technology to exist.
Yeah, that's a good point. Christine, did you have a comment?
Yeah, just two quick comments. So I completely agree that we want to make sure that when retail investors try and access markets and they go through an intermediary, the intermediary doesn't disappear in the middle of the night. Absolutely. That said, there are a lot of concepts that are great, like best execution, but almost seem that have to be completely rethought in this new world. It's really, really complicated. And so that has to be sort of carved out. And the other thing that I just wanted to point out is the reason why we think that it's good for people to invest in markets is because they're taking the other side of a deal, and the deal is essentially something to do with capital formation. Now, what's weird about a lot of these assets is they're not dividend-paying stocks and they're not cash flow based. They're basically, in some very funky way, incorporating the inside of a firm that's being sold to people. And so it would be really useful if there was a sort of careful delineation of what should be, what information would be useful to people. They're buying something that essentially they're going to sell, and that's the source of the value, not because the thing is going to pay them cash. And so there has to be almost like a new accounting regime that tells people what they need to know to evaluate that resale risk. And that's a big problem, but I think information, that kind of information, very, very important because these are not cash flow bearing assets.
Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, if I can just agree on the point about, you asked what should be scoped in, just to say what should be scoped out, meaning that the president's executive order and in many of these conversations, if you are not in an intermediated framework, it should preserve the right to self-custody and for there not to need to be intermediation where the end user wants to retain custody of the private keys. So that's one thing I like to say. And my other comment, just going back to something that was referenced earlier about, and I don't want to rabbit hole yet on the order protection rule if we're not ready to go there, but I'm going to do it anyway for a minute.
Go ahead.
Because to me, it's one of those things that in going through that archaeology of which rules were put in place when, I remember precisely why that happened, and there were, the intermarket trading system was working a particular way, people were trading through one another, and so on and so forth. And so the rule was put in place. I'm of the point of view, going back to the discussion on Reg ATS, that we were just on the cusp of the competition that rule put in place, causing us to have the competition necessary to force people to see when and where their brokers went to the best price and how algorithms worked and how smart routers worked and all of those kinds of things. And I think I'm of the opinion that competition would have gotten us to the right place without the need for all of the things that came along with the order protection rule. And the reason I say that is, and it goes back to what have we learned from how Bitcoin trades today. When we look at how Bitcoin trades, particularly now that we have the ETF and what happens in the trading window when there's creations and redemptions, it trades a lot like a large cap stock without any of the belt and suspenders and other things that are happening.
Suspenders.
It has similar transaction cost. In fact, it's less than many of the top decile of the S&P 500. And I say that because in this moment when we're going back to first principles, I think we have to ask, some things are going to be really important, investor protection and how we do segregation and so forth, but I think we have to
segregation, sir, it's 2025, you can't be saying that.
And that to me was a good example, which is why I wanted to bring it up.
So I'd really like to add on to that, because I think it's important when you talk about the order protection rule, which is one example here. I think it's important that everyone remembers that we have we'll soon have a new SEC commissioner, a chairman, who was a commissioner 19 years ago and was a dissenting against Reg NMS. In his dissent, this is Commissioner Atkins, he specifically referenced the order protection rule as the reason for his defense and his dissent, and noted that it would focus innovation around speed, which indeed it had. And I agree with you, Greg. I think we would definitely have got there anyway without that. So it was whilst it was needed for a moment in time there, I don't think that's needed anymore. And we certainly shouldn't consider an order protection rule for crypto. I've got a quote here from Commissioner Peirce from quite recently. We ought not be bound by the way we have long regulated existing financial markets. We should welcome the opportunity to reevaluate existing regulation in the light of these questions and ensure its appropriateness for both traditional and new markets. So I think, what I take from that is that we can learn a lot from crypto markets that can improve our traditional markets as well, like the order protection rule. Another thing that we had in Reg NMS was the ban on locked and crossed markets. Well, we have locked and crossed markets in crypto all the time. And guess what? They unlock and they uncross, and things seem to work fine. So I think we've got a lot of lessons. It's not just about imposing TradFi rules on crypto. It's about what can we learn from the evolution of markets from crypto and look at the overall rules that we have, including TradFi.
Ty, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I want to pick up on something a little bit earlier too. So for those who don't know, the order protection rule is a backstop for best execution, but it, rather than being related to brokers, it somehow applies to the exchanges and says you can't do something that you would otherwise do, which is a weird way to go about it, but there were good reasons at the time to take this approach. One of the things you sort of think about is if you have some of the disclosures we now have, bipartisan adopted during the first Trump administration, 605 and 606, which are order routing and execution relating disclosures. If you see trade con firms that actually tell the customer how their orders are routed. If you have, for lack of a better phrase, a useful tape that they can go back and do a transaction cost analysis on so they know if their broker's really doing a good job or not. Because that's where institutional investors are going to be focused on. I need to know if they're doing a good job for me or not. And if you hear even many of the largest institutional investors in the equities markets are saying the order protection rule doesn't help us now as much as it may hurt us. But knowing how their orders are handled, knowing what the real market looks like from public tapes, and being able to perform an analysis, they can actually police themselves. So there, I think that that's a great example of the order protection rule exists as a best execution protection, but it's kind of focused on the wrong entities and sort of in a haphazard way that we could say, hey, maybe that's not the thing here, but it does put more focus on the need for the transparency of orders and executions across, frankly, on and off chain and across all of the different venues.
One of the things to remember with at least a piece of how OPR ended up being implemented was it borrowed from how many of the ECNs prior to Reg NMS routed to one another. And so there was kind of this commercial adoption of, hey, you might have a better price. I'm trying to get a better price for my client. Let's connect and we'll route to one another. And so the implementation of that and the requirement of it relied on private connectivity from one exchange to another. And I think that's something too to look at. I was thinking about this when Richard was talking about, best X from a broker-dealer perspective with respect to Bitcoin or Ethereum. Is really interesting to think about what does that look like in a world where a broker-dealer could have a crypto asset alongside an ETF, right? And I think one of the things that I just find fascinating is the spread plus execution cost in basis point difference between ETFs, the most liquid ETFs, and the cash crypto market. And there are different elements of what you can do. If you own, a Bitcoin, right, you can self-custody it, it's on chain. But to me, those are just interesting things. And what is it about all of the built-up regulatory constructs that exist in U.S. equities, the adaptation, right? Don't discount for 1 second that market participants, whether they live in securities land in equities or in crypto, like the practitioners in the market are very thoughtful and mindful individuals that have economic objectives that are first principles of trading that, if there's a will, there's a way. And so regulation often is set and then market structure evolves around it and becomes something that really, might not have been intended originally. And I think many of us that are close to equities feel that way, right? There are many things about NMS and OPR that have led to sort of the law of unintended consequences. But I would just say, coupling NMS too much with crypto trading, we also have to be mindful of not just addressing the things with NMS that we want to address, even though it's been tried many, many times. They're kind of two different things.
And John, you raise a good point there regarding NMS aspects that perhaps we should absolutely not carry forward with respect to crypto trading. And I think there are probably, in my mind, perhaps more in that category than there are things we should maintain. Anyone want to get into that? Any other particular ideas? OPR perhaps on the table, but what else
I'd
are on
like
folks'
to hear
minds?
more about apple cider vinegar. Anyone?
Dave, go ahead, yeah.
I can
there.
start.
More about
there's probably
ECB?
most of it that should not. I think I would agree with you on that, Nick. I agree that NMS served a purpose at a time.
ECB.
And the markets have changed. And if we're thinking about a decentralized system fundamentally in cryptographic securities and cryptographic assets, it's hard to impose our centralized mindset on that, I think. There are many ways in which I don't think it's possible. Now, I think there are ways to consider if we are bringing tokenized securities on exchange and providing a framework to support the existence of tokenized securities side by side with traditional securities. There are probably things we can think about in terms of maybe market data consolidation, but it's always going to be imperfect because these things will also always trade in other places. And it's not just that it will trade in other places domestically, but it's a global system. And so I find the idea of trying to envision how you consolidate that from a regulatory perspective to be one that's very difficult to kind of get my head around. I don't think that should prevent the SEC and the CFTC from working together to build platforms to collect data from all of these places or anything that might be under their purview could trade, and to look much more like a data-centric and data-forward regulator that is, if not collecting it themselves, working with excellent vendors in the industry to accomplish it. Because if you consider the state of the art right now, and firms like Cumberland, I would think of DRW as probably having state-of-the-art data systems and analytic systems, right? And then you think about what regulators have today. We're so far apart. I find that really disturbing, and I find it really hard to imagine how you can regulate and oversee a market without having those kinds of capabilities. And it really gets into questions around what I think Reg NMS has done well through this consolidation is to help to at least surveil markets and address market manipulation issues. I think market manipulation is a real fundamental problem in this space, and I wish I had a good answer. I don't have a great answer for how you get there, but I do think that needs to be front and center in any regulatory efforts, is understanding and measuring and collecting in order to figure out how to police and enforce issues around market manipulation.
Well, and in many cases, there's a public blockchain that could be referred to, right? Does
It's
anyone
like
want to tackle
panacea,
that?
right? Like the fact that this is all on chain should be like a panacea for analytics and data, and yet I don't think regulators have gotten there yet.
You can keep riffing if you want, or if anyone else wants to jump in with that.
Well, it's sort of, there are some analogs, right? So to the extent that you have, for example, transactions that don't occur on exchanges end up being reported someplace, right? And so you have a data stream that the world can reference, regulators can reference. I appreciate, by the way, the pitch for the SEC having like a Midas system for digital assets. I'm all for it. Let's go. Get some economists working on it.
Are you going to spin up that business? Are you going to be the vendor
staffing
guy?
proposals?
Yeah.
I'm not sure how that's working right now, but we'll see how it goes. But one of the things I think we really want to focus on is for Reg NMS, I would say there's a lot that goes with it too, right? Like, for example, you do have mandatory disclosures that people are able to see. You get to know, in general, how your broker's doing. But that function now, for institutional investors, you get to know really specifically what they're doing for you. You get to see the trading venues, how good a job they're doing. Those are things that I think should be carried forward. Maybe not the way they're structured in NMS, but that function needs to happen. Because again, I'm coming at this from, if you're trying to get sophisticated institutional investors are going to be perhaps a little bit less cavalier than maybe the wealthy individual who's out on his E-Trade account after finishing his day as a dentist. Or otherwise, those folks who have fiduciary obligations are going to be really cautious about interacting with firms that they don't have a regulatory backstop for trust, and they don't have a regulatory backstop for resilience. So they're going to feel a lot more comfortable dealing with someone who's registered as a broker-dealer than someone who's not. They can explain to their boards why they hired an investment advisor that has a registered investment advisor that has a regulatory framework that their boards understand, than, hey, this is someone who's not a registered investment advisor, but they're going to take care of this stuff for us.
I just want to agree with that. I think that particularly as the functions, collapse into an entity that, there are potential conflicts of interest, the best way to cure those potential conflicts of interest is with disclosures. And whether that's a trade confirmation or, the sorts of things that 605 and 606 and all of those things give you, give investors and put in their hands the information they need to be able to make educated decisions about, is this happening in my best interest or not? And I think with those disclosures, being able to be more efficient and doing these things in a way that takes advantage of settlement and puts together, some of these functions to make them operationally more seamless, I think you get the best of both.
Well, go ahead, yeah.
I was just going to add on to that. In addition to just thinking about multiple functions in a single entity, it's not just disclosures. When the technology advances, that you end up losing the reason for having that natural segregation, like for clearing agents. It used to be that clearing agents exist both to take centrally custody assets, but perhaps also because the time for settlement took so long, those things are disappearing, and so then it can make a lot more sense, and you are not in the risk profile that you were years ago in a crypto trading world if someone is performing those functions of a clearing agent without those risks alongside other functions. So just to build on what Greg had said there.
What about using the blockchain for price discovery, transparency? Any thoughts on that?
How much is occurring on it, right? I mean, that's one of the things that we have to know, time horizons and how much is actually getting reported and when and in what fashion. So if you're in a world where everything is reported nearly instantaneously, and we have firms here who are making decisions in nanoseconds on trading, and there's a lot to be made in those nanoseconds. And so if we're talking about reporting the blockchain that's measured in things that aren't nanoseconds, and positions that may or may not ever be reported, it creates a significant challenge. These aren't new challenges, by the way. We have the exact same challenges in the U.S. equities markets, right? When we have a derivative position that doesn't have to be reported, but if it was an actual equity position, it would be. We end up with opportunities for problems like 𝐂𝐴𝐧. So, we have to recognize that none of these issues are particularly new. We just get a new chance to think about why we did them this way, and maybe we could do them differently. But I think the blockchain offers a great reference point, certainly a great starting point, but you also have to get to what off-chain. Are you talking about de minimis exceptions? Are you talking about de minimis on a digital asset by digital asset? Are you talking about de minimis that looks at firms? Are you talking about a de minimis that is, hey, if this is self-custody? Because, again, I don't want to skip into another topic, but we're not just talking about the trading, we're also talking about positions. In these assets, you have unique risks that are not unlike penny stocks, where you can have very concentrated positions and decisions being made by those concentrated positions that can materially negatively impact the other holders and those trading markets.
Well, let's talk about thinly traded stocks for a minute. And Chelsea, I want to bring you in on this. So, and Ty, I think you mentioned Rule 211. Thoughts on, is that feasible? Ty, I think you may have said doesn't really make sense.
The other way.
The other way, okay.
The other way.
How would that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think, from our perspective, I think 15C211, something like it, where you sort of have this
never
obligation
hear
to
her,
make
by
sure
the
that
way.
information is
What's up,
current,
Mimo?
it's publicly available, having disclosures about sort of the material aspects of a token and sort of how the underlying network works, governance, the project team, and sort of in their holdings of tokens, to the point you just made, Ty. I think that is important. That's healthy for markets. I think there are some aspects of the current 15C211 that maybe don't work well for natively digital crypto assets.
Too much
Sort of
bears.
things like you have to have financial statements of the issuer. You have to have the name and address of the transfer agent. I mean, you sort of think part of the sort of value proposition of a lot of these assets is that the blockchain serves the role of a transfer agent. So you may not have that. So I think there's sort of areas where with maybe we can talk a little later about maybe an exemptive order or staff relief or something like that that could sort of make the rule fit well with crypto assets. But I think sort of the general idea of something like a 15C211 type of disclosure, I think, is good for markets, and that kind of transparency is helpful.
Yeah, I know it's not what you'd necessarily think. Totally agree. So I think there's an important aspect here of the OTC markets do a pretty reasonable job of telling you, hey, this is something for which there's no real information available, and oh, by the way, here's something for which there is. And brokers are expected to kind of have an understanding of what's going on in that asset. And, it may not be that it's issuer financial statements, but it may be, hey, you have to have a real sort of scraping of information, or hey, there has to be some notice if there's hey, there might be governance changes, right? They have to be, constantly sort of scraping what I will call the rest of the world in the internet. Maybe there's third-party service providers who may provide that function. I think that is really important. I don't think that imposing the same sort of expectations you would on an equities market makes sense. Frankly, I'm not sure that investors really worry about that stuff in all of the equity space either, in the land of meme stocks. So I think I think it does make sense to take a step back and say, you ought to know what the thing is you're trading, and that's the point, I think, of 15C211, and really big information that might dramatically impact the value of that and the trading of that. And I think that's a really good way to approach it.
I'd like to comment on that as well. I agree with everything everyone's been saying here. I think 15C211 is a good example of how we can move forward. So going back to what we've been talking about is that, well, if the investors are coming through brokers and the broker is going to say, well, these exchanges in my best execution routing order. At the same time, we've got to make a decision. It's like, okay, which assets are we going to offer? Obviously, Bitcoin, Ether, Solana, things like that. But then you get lower down the list. How do we decide which ones, are, I don't know, let's say safe, quote unquote, safe to offer customers, or have this reasonable information, reasonable disclosures out there? So I think that's a useful tool. Who is making the disclosures? Is the question, though, for decentralized assets with no issuer, with no CEO, with no CFO. So that's, I think, one of the things we really need to tackle. It could be, it could be a foundation who's behind the coin. It could be a DAO that has issued the governance token. Or maybe you'll see companies like Moody's and S&P coming into the space and doing this type of service, or other third-party people. But I think it's a really good framework and analogy to move forward on.
I think one thing, and you were talking a bit about this, my general understanding of it, there's a pretty big difference between the listing standards in what we would consider the typical world of exchange-listed securities, and this world, particularly with things like ongoing listing standards and disclosures, as you were talking about, and that I think may work with certain constructs. The one thing I think we all have a shared interest in is making sure that what is thought of or what is pursued does not in any way export or put at risk the SEC's jurisdiction over aspects of 90 plus years of securities regulation that kind of plays back to those principles from before. And and that's where I say again, the precision really matters, right? What it is you're talking about, to some of the things Richard was mentioning. I think it is pretty material here.
And you mentioned the word risk. Let's maybe talk about risk mitigation and some of the concepts that apply today to actually, achieve risk mitigation, whether it be net capital requirements or position limits or several other aspects that apply. Anyone want to take a stab at that? What should we carry forward? What just probably doesn't work, and let's leave it behind?
Altcoin.
Go ahead, Dave. Yeah, let go, Dave.
Okay. So now we're at least crossing over in my notes where I got into how, but I'll
We've been in the how for a while.
Right,
Yeah,
so
it's okay.
fine, good.
We
right.
bled into my whole system fell apart 30 minutes ago.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And I do want to get sort of to what Greg said earlier about conflicts of interest, and I think it dovetails exactly into risks. And there are some conflicts that can be cured with disclosure. And I think there are lots that cannot be cured with disclosure. And I think that that's what we have learned in the traditional finance world, over a very long period of time, and a lot of investor harm, and a lot of various crises that we've had to address. And I do think that the vertical integration we see in the crypto industry, I think that there are some good reasons for it, and that there are some concerning reasons for it. And I don't believe it's just about the prohibition, on the other side, the prohibition of vertical integration in the traditional finance world is not just based on settlement times. There's a lot more that goes on because we have decided in the traditional finance world that we need structural safeguards in place to control things like an exchange that trades on its own platform with a proprietary trading desk, an exchange that issues its own tokens, has a real fundamental conflict and vested interest in the token's price. Combining custody with trading means the platform can hold customer funds. That was obviously a serious problem with FTX and Alameda. When one firm is the sole venue and intermediary, competition can be stifled. You can often not see the benefits of best execution, especially if there's no affirmative obligation for it. So that could be something that could help. It can lead to concentration, and that can lead to systemic risks. I don't think we're seeing that, and I think as long as we stay sort of sufficiently decentralized in this space, maybe the systemic risk issue isn't as much of an issue. But I do think that there is a reason that we have decided in the traditional finance world to structurally separate certain conflicts rather than just depend on disclosure. And that is not to say that, I'm a very big fan of disclosure everywhere that we can get it, and transparency everywhere we can get it. But I think we've seen a lot of fallout when we have relied on disclosure first and foremost. And I don't want to see those mistakes repeated here.
Christine, you want to jump in?
Yeah, just really quickly. I think the regulations that the SEC can do when they affect people that live in the U.S. that I could probably stalk if I figured out where they live, they're going to be great. They're going to make people safe. Regulations or purported regulations around
Stalking is bad.
the resiliency or the value proposition of specific tokens. These are things in a decentralized world that the SEC really cannot control. So, for example, things about boards of directors or governance. In a world with governance tokens and swaps, somebody can undo anything that was disclosed 6 months ago. So I think it's really important for whatever the SEC decides to do to basically make clear that it can speak directly to institutions in the US that are customer facing. It can give you information about tokens and other things that are happening, but it cannot guarantee in any way, shape, or form how those things are going to turn out, right? So telling people what the SEC is not guaranteeing is almost as important as just having a quiet guarantee in the background, just so people understand what they're facing, I think.
It kind of reminds me of doing background.
Tokens.
When I came to the Senate, I started researching the
them?
origins of the securities laws, and it reminds me of the fights that were had over whether or not the SEC should be given, or the FTC at the time, should be given authority to basically say a security was blessed, or whether or not, hey, it's registered and it meets these disclosure obligations, and whether or not there's a sort of a merits-based system. And it's an interesting discussion we're having now. So first thing I want to say is I co-sign everything Dave said. It was brilliant, and I agreed with my panelists here so far. I think one of the changes that we're a little bit, I think we have to worry a lot about not just investor protection, but the competitiveness of it.
Very worried.
And I think when we think about the competitiveness and the efficiency and the integrity, and frankly the fairness, that's the SEC's mission. Those functions are functions of regulation, right? Like as you alluded to earlier, if the SEC sets a rule, the market's going to compete to figure out how to maximize their profitability around the structure of that rule. And it doesn't necessarily work the other way around. And in the absence of a clear best execution obligation, there's a heck of a lot of not best execution that goes on. And we would make this market a lot more competitive if there was a more direct best execution obligation. I would argue, I spend a lot of my time on behalf of large institutional investors thinking about how they manage counterparty risk. And, these things come up when you have moments like 𝐂𝐽𝐻, but these moments come up, frankly, all of the time. And sadly, my career has been marked by extreme moments of that, be it, let's just call it September of 2008. Let's call it, frankly, every 3 or 4 or 5 years, there's these significant moments of counterparty risk. If you're an institutional investor and you believe in a digital asset, it is, and at the same time, you have perhaps a statutorily, maybe state statute, maybe regulatory imposed fiduciary obligation. It is extremely difficult to engage in the native space right now. Those folks at Coinbase and others who are trying to do so are finding it very challenging, in part because they don't get to say, hey, FINRA rules and these SEC structures are protecting you beyond of what I may promise. Right? Going back to trust and resiliency, promises are nice from financial firms, but it's a lot better when you have the full force of the federal government ensuring that that trust exists and is well-founded.
I agree. And
For some reason, I just don't like that guy. I don't know what it is. I don't like him.
When we say assets are backed 1 for 1, it would be nice to say in the future, and by the way, 15c3 and all of these things require that assets
100%.
are segregated and all those sorts of things. But I do want to go back to something that Dave said, and maybe Dave, a question, which is today within the broker-dealer, if we're pattern matching to broker-dealer and ATS, that variety of things happen today in the broker-dealer world where you act in a variety of different capacities and you're matching orders. And how in your mind is that different than I think what is proposed to move towards? And those conflicts of interest that happen within a broker-dealer are often cured through disclosure. We're not mandating that it all happen in this sort of broker exchange clearinghouse sort of taxonomy, for example.
I mean, maybe my perspective on this isn't a very popular one. I don't believe they have been cured through disclosure. I'm against ATS is operated by routed broker-dealers, have been for a long time. I'm against internalization and the fundamental conflicts of interest that payment for order flow pose in the equity space. So, we like to say that they have been disclosed away, but they haven't. And we like to say that we get best execution in the traditional equity space, but we don't. We get good enough execution and not best execution. I think there's a fundamental difference between those two, and I believe that there are ways structurally we can address those conflicts. And so, sorry.
I want to make one sort of, actually ask a general question about the vertical integration trend that's evolved in the space. And I find myself wondering how much of that is a result of the lack of a regulator taking that industry, that emerging technology, in early enough to help it conform in the right ways, whatever the right levels of segregation are. Because one of the things that it does pose is, going back to my best X example, between, hey, how do I get best price for my customer if they want access to Bitcoin, if my choices are cash on some exchange or to some bilateral counterparty on the blockchain or an ETF, you have the same problem in trading crypto assets where there's no interconnectivity, right, in between blockchains, between vertical sort of centralized exchange models. And I think there is some oversight needed to the degree best X is a principled based goal. That will have to be sort of brought in some fashion.
There's also a liquidity sourcing issue too, right? Like, to the extent that if there's only one particular venue to trade it, and I'm not entirely sure that all of the trading on that may be reflected on the chain, I don't know what liquidity may be out there, right? And so if you're an institutional investor, there's a significant amount of risk associated with that particular digital asset. Or maybe you have a couple of places where you may be able to trade. And you again, I hate to go back to like position reporting and trade reporting, but without sort of large position reporting and trade reporting, you don't know what you don't know. And if you're an institutional investor, that's extremely concerning. In a world where governance changes can happen very quickly because of those things, in a world where markets can move very, very quickly. And so I want to piggyback on the top of that.
Austin, let's get you in, yeah.
Yeah, a couple things here. First of all, great conversation, and I think it's interesting to dive deeper onto the security side too, and think through, what we can learn from the existing frameworks and regulation. A couple of things that I do just want to add though, because I think part of this is also an exercise of, at least my mental model right now, is the assumption that I'm operating within is that most of these commodities are actually not going to be regulated by the CFTC. Or excuse me, by the SEC, wrong agency. But that you will see that most of those will actually fall out of the jurisdiction. And the question will be, will broker-dealers actually be able to transact these assets? The thing that I will add here is I think striving for best execution is great. I think it is impossible if you're just looking at the US markets, and I think the data 100% proves that, right? And so I think that the question for us to be asking is, if we want to be competitive at a global scale, if we want institutions to come into this market and continue to come in and trade, what is the path for us to actually compete and win volume onshore, right? And I think a couple ideas that I would flag that I think may be longer term, but I think it does make sense for the US to look at whether there is regulatory reciprocity that you could have with different regions outside of the United States, where there may be exchanges that are operating businesses within those. I think a big component of that, from my perspective, I've probably met with 5,000 institutional customers in the past couple of years. In terms of FalconX, we have over 1,000 that are with us today. I actually hear best execution as an issue very infrequently. I think the majority of the time the issues that I hear are counterparty risk, and how do I basically know that my assets are safe either on this exchange venue or with this custodian, and who is providing leverage and whose role is that within the ecosystem. Right? And so I think the broker-dealer components make a lot of sense. I think we should be focused on them. But I think we also need to recognize the reality of this asset class today, whereas you're looking at crypto commodities that are trading globally 24/7, 365. How can we basically tie in liquidity there? And on the tokenized security side, I'd say the biggest issue is actually the lack of any trading activity there, right? Like, there's no significant market in tokenized securities today. Right? And so if we're looking at the SEC's role in creating this market, I think the question is, how do we actually create a market that has liquidity? Because that's what institutional investors want. And I think in lieu of that happening, it's going to be very difficult to grow and scale this.
I would love to build on where Austin was heading, because something struck me between the exchange with Dave and Greg is, how do we make sure that we're not just saying that a new solution, say disclosures, is imperfect, and then reverting to the one known solution, and then simply expanding and expanding and expanding the obligations of that known solution, as opposed to looking at green space and thinking, where do we actually want to be in our future innovation? So I certainly think that's true for segregation or not of functions in crypto trading beyond securities trading. When we think about what we've discussed, that this is global trading that is happening, it is different than anything we've seen before. And so what is the future state that we're heading for? The same thing is true, we touched on it a little bit, about principles of market surveillance. Even though we know that sunlight is good. It's good for markets to be open and operating transparently and publicly and fairly. All of that makes sense, but the world is moving towards a space where granular data collection is increasingly available, and that granularity comes with sensitivity of that information, confidentiality of that information, and frankly, uselessness of that information when we're talking about individual day-to-day economic activity. So how are we designing our future market surveillance structures, whether that's in a securities trading regime or a broader trading regime, to operate globally, but assuming we don't want to, and I certainly don't, not march us on a path towards mass surveillance of every single corner of economic activity on the globe. I don't think that's necessary to mitigate any of the risks that any of us care about here today. All of us have a shared interest in preventing bad actors, bad activity, or severe market events. So just kind of echoing what does the future state need to be, and is there more than just the tools we already know of to get there?
And in terms of go ahead.
Sorry, thanks, Nick.
Yeah,
I do want to pick up on one thing that Austin said. I'm going to agree with you and disagree with you. I'm going to disagree with you about having certain assets go to the CFTC and certain assets go to the SEC. I think we need to stop pretending that it makes sense that it to be two separate regulatory agencies. They should really be merged. So let's not, when we make new rules, we're not going to do that. We're not going to solve that today. But when we make new rules, let's not exacerbate this silly separation that we have. People want to, you can trade the 𝐂𝐴 is very similar risk profile to a NASDAQ futures contract, but different regulators. So I think we definitely, and that was one of the issues I had with the FIT 21 bill, is that it did have this bifurcation. So I hope we move beyond that in the new market structure bill. But what I think you are absolutely spot on about is the global nature of this asset class, and Catherine echoed that as well. And that's clearly, a lot of these activities are outside the jurisdiction of the SEC. So we have to recognize that the SEC can't regulate everything here. And if we start with saying, well, obviously they can't regulate global markets, then we need to understand that, well, these global markets are going to be trading anyway. And, they may have different prices in Korea or other areas. Is going to those markets best execution or not? So I think we have to think about that. And maybe to your point, Catherine, is that there's going to be other markets that are going to be fully decentralized. No headquarters, no owners, and so forth. And I don't know if it's going to be possible for the SEC to regulate these venues. And so we may end up having to have kind of a version of rules for the US, and there's going to be for the institutional investors and for everyday folks who are less experienced. They can come through a regulated broker-dealer, but we have to be aware this is a global asset class that trades 24/7, and there are going to be pockets, very, very large ones, it sounds like, that are trading outside of the purview of the US government here.
Okay, so I have very bad flashbacks to late 2009 and early 2010, working across the park here in the United States Senate building and trying to negotiate with a very shy person, you may have heard of him, Gary Gensler, about what he thought cross-border derivative regulation should look like. And it went about as well for me as it did for many staff here. I apologize. The reality is these issues aren't new. As it turns out, commodities trade globally. As it turns out, there are other trading venues outside of the US jurisdiction. I think there is something you mentioned earlier about reciprocity. That in and of itself is, as anyone who's ever been involved in that process, sadly I have, some of the people here have as well, it's a bit of a nightmare, but it can be done. And one of the things I think we have to recognize is, much like the commodities markets that Austin just referenced, we're not doing anything that's new here. There isn't anything particular about a Bitcoin trading that's fundamentally different than trading other assets that are also regulated by other venues and other brokers and other regulators outside of our borders. I actually go back again to the OTC marketplace for just a second, because if we think about that marketplace, you have very, very large, very, very public foreign issuers who have lots of liquidity, lots of information issued by the issuer, regulated by somebody else, all the way down to entities that have really no existing issuer and no real transparency still trading on those markets. And if you go to that and try to trade on those markets, one, you may not be able to find quotations, or two, you may find a skull and crossbones on the website actually warning you, this might not be a good idea, right? And if we think about how we want to approach cross-border trading, I think we can learn from some of those things. I don't think we just throw our hands up and say, we can only do what we can do. I think you do that by bilateral negotiations with other jurisdictions, much like we've had to do in other areas. It ain't fun. It takes a long time. And there's a lot of discussions that have to go back and forth, but you do your best.
Let's actually go to the technology. We talked a little bit earlier about ways in which the commission might be able to actually utilize technology like public blockchains to aid in its mission and regulation and perhaps even surveillance. I'm going to say something that might be a little bit controversial. Forever, the SEC has basically taken an approach where they say our rules are technology neutral. We're not going to differentiate between this tech or that tech. I think it's about time that we might have to actually change that, given the underpinnings of the technology that make something with Catherine's business different than something with Greg's business. And really welcome thoughts from the panel on that.
I mean, I think looking back historically, we were talking about order routing, and in many ways, aspects of, a very prescriptive set of market structure rules like NMS did incorporate ways technology had evolved in industry. But I think in many ways, it sort of depends, right? You have to separate the technological capabilities of what a said blockchain does. You were talking before about how do you get data off of a particular blockchain. You have to think about latency differently. You have to think about how, who is validating transactions? How are those blocks put up? How important is ordering, right? These are very fundamental sort of critical things that have lived in various worlds of trading for a long time. And, thinking about that data source, that golden source, is important because you really have to understand at some point, if you want to be able to successfully, I think we believe trust in something, you have to kind of understand what and whom is behind it. So I think the truest form of decentralized finance is a very difficult thing for any modern regulator around the world to kind of wrap their heads around. Because if you want to have access to information and be able to understand the why, it's critical to be able to go back and see those things. So.
But when we're doing things like determining broker status, exchange status, responsibilities, best X, I mean, people don't even know what best X is today for equities, I would argue. So how are we going to know what it is for crypto, given all the points that have been discussed today? And when it comes to different technologies, how do we look at that? Catherine, really interested in your thoughts.
Well, I wanted to jump right back to your question on technology neutral, because I think the reason that concept is rightly appealing is to the extent it is risk consistent. But there are new technologies sometimes that changes the risk profile. So technology neutral when the risk is consistent regardless of the technology, but perhaps not technology neutral, or perhaps risk consistency is the overarching principle and technology neutral is a subset of that. So just wanted to add that piece in. I think going back to the example of self-custody wallets versus custody wallets, you wouldn't treat them the same way even though they're both holding an asset, right? You wouldn't say you're technology neutral to a wallet holding an asset when the custodial risk either exists or doesn't. So that might be a really fundamental example.
Thoughts from anybody else? Dave, Austin?
I would say this kind of gets back to like the 211 discussion earlier. Is there enough that's disclosed for the SEC to remain neutral and to be able to remain neutral? And I think we can get there. This is where I will go down the path of disclosure and thinking that this is something that is sorely needed right now, which is this true path to registration and this disclosure standard where maybe this is yet another opportunity for regulatory cooperation with the CFTC and SEC, and maybe with global regulators. I mean, we keep talking about how these are global assets, and they trade 24/7, and there are some differences. I really believe fundamentally between what we have traditionally seen most of our investment and trading volume in the United States, and so it seems like it's a real tremendous opportunity for global cooperation and establishing some global standards. And I thought, again, back to Cumberland's piece, the written proposal with the changes to 211, I thought were really excellent and a great starting point for building off a disclosure regime that can have enough information in it that, then at least investors can make their own determinations around risk and start to get their head around it in a standardized way. Because I think one of the big problems here and one of the big impediments to both institutional and retail adoption has been a lack of standardized disclosures and the inability to get sort of plain language information to less sophisticated people. Not everyone understands the nuances of various consensus protocols across different blockchains. And I think that that information is good to have for all sorts of sophisticated participants and practitioners, but if you want investors to come into this space, you need to get up to their level, and it needs to be something that's consistent so that you can compare different things and make educated choices.
Christine, jump in.
Oh, just a small sort of aside. It's not clear to me that a blockchain is particularly useful for regulatory information. Blockchain will tell me which wallets are holding what. That's fine. I don't know who's behind the wallet. And it's also sort of, when transactions happen, basically things get written onto the blockchain by strategic actors, and they can choose when that information hits. So basically they can do essentially a private transaction. So it's perhaps not the best way of monitoring what people are doing.
So she just tipped off the thing I was going to go to, which is when you're talking about, again, what an institutional investor or what an investor wants to look at, they want to know what the market will look like. And they want to look, they've already made the decision, perhaps, based on whatever they know about the digital asset. So I'm going to set aside what the investor thinks, whether or not they want to make a decision to invest in the asset, and focus on what are the things that once they've decided to make the investment, what are the things that are giving them pause or keeping them out of the markets altogether. A lot of it is that trust, right? And so if one is the trust in the trading of the markets, are they looking at real prices or real data? And if they're only looking at blockchains, they know there might be a lot more to the world than what they can see. They're worried about whether or not their broker may be ripping them off. They're worried about whether or not the asset that is custodied is real and safe and secure and bankruptcy remote. They wonder about whether or not their broker is actually surveying all of the things, and maybe their broker is just sloppy, right? These are all things we can see in traditional trading markets that we can't see here. And so if you try to scale that up to millions or billions of dollars of investment for a single or maybe a handful of institutional investors, those things go from things that maybe I, in my retail crypto account, might ignore, but they're not going to, and they can't.
Chelsea, jump in.
Yeah, I mean, so just piggybacking off of both those comments and kind of thinking about how timing mismatches work between transactions and then it's showing up on the blockchain. I think that can sort of actually lead to Austin's point about needing to have commodities being able to be traded alongside with securities, pairs together, because I think otherwise you're going to sort of face a situation where a lot of times that we at Cumberland face today, where you've got sort of one side of the transaction happening in crypto and the other in fiat, and you've just got these timing mismatches where the crypto leg can be settled essentially right away, but then the fiat leg might take a day, it might take multiple days if it's over a weekend, and so to tie to your point about counterparty credit risk, like that, if you're going days with one side having settled the trade and the other one sort of waiting to settle, I think that creates a lot of risk that, if you've got stable coins in the mix and you're able to have a broker dealer that can have, stable coins trading alongside, whether it's tokenized securities or natively digital securities, I think that can help mitigate a lot of the, counterparty credit risk that you have. But I think there are a number of barriers to that. And I think one is this concept of, automatic 100% haircut that we saw.
Haircut, she said it.
Rule and
She's
otherwise
listening.
For, non-security crypto assets. And I think, maybe that's justified for some, crypto assets out there that are, less liquid, more volatile. But I just think, for Bitcoin, for Ether, for stable coins, just to say automatically we have 100% haircut, without kind of looking at the data of is that warranted? I think, that's going to kill a business that where, if you're trying to put, commodities and securities, crypto assets together under one roof, I just think it's going to make it prohibitively expensive to do that. So I think we should at least have sort of a data-driven look at whether that makes sense and whether, maybe we start with sort of the standard 20% haircut for readily marketable commodities.
Haircut, she said a
which
drink.
Crypto assets do we think are readily marketable? I think, sort of piggybacking off of what John said, if we've got crypto assets that are liquid enough to support, ETPs trading on the underlying or futures trading on the underlying, maybe that's a good place to start of do we think those are readily marketable? Do we think those could have a haircut less than 100%? But those are just my thoughts.
And we're at time, and I think that's actually a really good segue to session 2 at 3:30. So we're going to take about a 30-minute break. I hope our internet friends are still here with us.
No,
Thank you
we're
for everyone
not.
here
We're
who's stuck
not
with
here.
us, and I thought that was a really great.
We're not here. We are here. You know, as always, these things can be so boring and so dry. But we took away a lot of stuff here today. One, very, very bullish on apple cider vinegar. Shout out to AVC. It's our new jam. 2, that Taco Bell is the dev of Fartcoin. And you can just, in one trip to Taco Bell, you could be a Fartcoin whale. This has been really kind of boring, and there's been some things of substance that have been said, which actually diverges from the normal that we see in these meetings. Typically, it's people very out of touch, clearly not crypto native, yet a lot of the people that spoke, even if we didn't love some of the things they said, had an understanding of crypto. And one thing that really caught my ear and I appreciated was even just the use of the word or the term decentralized. We really never heard anyone from the government or representing the government say decentralized. And in fact, I don't think that vocabulary was even in the government's reach, maybe until very recently. So it's nice to see some people who might have an idea about crypto talking about crypto and talking about the future of regulation. I view that as very bullish long term. Does that mean tomorrow or today we're going up? Absolutely not. But unrelated, we may be moving up. Looking for a close today above 82.6 with a nice bullish order block cooking. Let them cook. Close above there, and I'm going to be looking for a test of the 50 and 200 daily moving averages, which would put us exactly where we have been saying. We have said that the death cross is following the course of the last 2 years, the bull run, the bottom of the local move, and after the cross occurs, we look to go test the 250, and at the moment, and man, I don't want to get you guys too excited, I don't want to get you too amped up for this, that does kind of look like what's happening here. We saw a good amount of rallying during the stream today. Let's close bullish engulf. Let's pray that the weekend doesn't bring us dumpage. And let's wrap our fart coins. You can mine some fart coins at home. Dude, the jokes are infinite. They're infinite. I don't own any fart coin, guys. I'm not recommending you buy it. Certainly, it's funny to laugh about. What else do we have to look at? It did go up over the last 48 hours. So probably why we're joking about it. You've all disappointed me by buying it, by pumping it. That's probably why people are talking about it. I don't know, man. We need laughs. Ethereum, Bitcoin not making us laugh in the happy way, maybe in the sad way. Heading down to support still. No sign of a bounce against Bitcoin. Bitcoin dominance catching my eye as well. Not looking like it's going to be a very friendly weekend for the alts. Dominance hitting potentially another higher low. It's been inevitable. If you've been watching this channel, I don't know how you could have watched this channel without expecting this with me, without literally almost every single day waiting for higher highs and potentially to even shock the world by setting a new cycle high on dominance. I don't know. I'm still calling for it, still going. Gold at all-time highs. Let me see. What else? Do we have anything else we got to touch here? XCN up considerably over the last 3 days. I wouldn't touch this though. I don't love that move. I don't love this move. Seen this before get faded. Above like 3.6 cents we'll rediscover. So here's what I'd like for you guys to do. We are live here Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and often in between, but guaranteed Monday, Wednesday, Friday, around 1 p.m. East. I'd like you to subscribe, smash the like on this live stream, join us on Monday, but also check out joincrowncrypto.com. We are going to be having, and we do have, exclusive live streams in there every day of the week. On Friday, I do them. We're going to do, it's basically just like small group hanging out. The group isn't for everyone. No, it's not free. But you can get a free week trial to decide if it's for you. It's not for everyone. It's for people really looking to invest in their crypto future, and I'm going to help you with it. I've decided that if you sign up for a year, you can get a year subscription. If you sign up for a year, I will meet with you one-on-one. And I will help you kind of organize and get geared up towards your goal. That's a limited time offer. I only have so many hours in the